Thomas Thierst videos are brought to you by my Patreons and viewers like you. Thank you. This video is sponsored by CarKey. Do you want overpriced Thomas ties that are damaged and don't even look like the products you bought? Do you want terrible AI dubs of classic Thomas episodes? Then CarKey is the website for you. Use promo code ERNIE69420 to get 4% off annual shipping. CarKey, because even you can lose your car keys too. Disclaimer, this video is not actually sponsored by CarKey. Writing stories can be a tricky thing to do. I think with some people, it just comes naturally to them, but how do writers make great stories? That's what this video is about. So today, I'm going to teach you how to become a great story writer. The only difference is, I'm not going to be the one giving you advice. It's instead going to be the Rev W. Awdry. Wait, what? So at this year's Awdry Extravaganza lecture, we got some new information about lore of the series, such as that Awdry originally envisaged Thomas as a Ginty, or that they considered many types of bases for Edward and James. But that wasn't what interested me at this year's Awdry. You see, in the lecture there was this segment that talked about how Awdry formed his stories. This really fascinated me, and it opened my eyes to how Awdry wrote his stories and streamlined his books. So today, I'm going to walk you through what Awdry's process was for making books better. Now, I want to make it clear that these tips won't apply to every Thomas story that you write, but I still think it's good that you should learn how Awdry formulated his stories, so that when it comes to writing your own stories, you can come up with your own rules on how to make your stories better and more interesting. So, let's begin with how Awdry created his books. So in order to understand how Awdry created his stories, we first must go over a little bit of history on how he wrote his first two books in the series. The first few stories that Awdry told to his son never came from a place of wanting to publicize them, but rather it was just to entertain his son Christopher. In fact, the first few books were based on existing railway rhymes, such as Down at the Station, Early in the Morning, See the Little Puffer Trains all in a row, Here Comes the Driver to start up the engine, Puff puff peep peep on we go. Wilbert would tell this rhyme to Christopher until he got sick of it and eventually asked for more stories. So, on the spot, Awdry created a character named Edward, and so puff puff peep peep on Edward would go to his first story, Edward's Day Out, which was essentially a continuation of the Down at the Station nursery rhyme. Henry's first story was also taken directly from a nursery rhyme. Once an engine, when fixed to a train, was alarmed at a few drops of rain, so it went puff from its funnel, then fled to a tunnel, and would not come out again. You can see the slight differences that Awdry made to the story, and much like Edward's story, Henry's story was also a continuation of that rhyme, where we see Henry get bricked up in the tunnel by the fat director. However, as the series progressed, Awdry naturally drifted away from expanding upon nursery rhymes, and started to write his own unique stories about the engines. He eventually came up with rules on how to write his stories, known as Awdry's Disciplines, which is what this video is about. Now, these rules were not all thought up at once. In fact, Awdry didn't consciously think about his disciplines until the late 60s, when Awdry's books became so well known that he was asked to speak at various literacy societies. It was when preparing for these lectures at these societies that Awdry started to analyze his writing techniques, which Awdry summed up under 5 simple headings: accuracy, consistency, brevity, careful choice of words, and fluency. This video will be the Cliff Notes version of that lecture. Wait, only 5 rules? Where's rule 55?
Rule 55. You can't do it.
These 5 rules are the bedrock of how Awdry formulated his stories, and if you're even a little bit interested in what makes the Railway series stories so good, then I highly recommend that you listen to these 5 rules that Awdry made. Starting off, we have rule 1, accuracy. Every single story that Awdry wrote for the Railway series was based on a real railway event in some form. And I do mean every single story. Henry crashes with the Flying Kipper? It was based on the Abton-Ripton crash of 1876. Percy runs away from Gordon? It was based on the Hans Junction crash of 1910. Or my personal favourite is Sir Handel's crash with George in Steamroller. It was based on a real crash that happened in County Cork in Ireland when a steamroller collided with a train. I could go on, but honestly, there is an endless list of stories and inspirations from the real-world railways that was used in the Railway series. There are so many inspirations that we don't even know all of them yet. Apparently though, Awdry did keep a scrapbook, and he would have every single crash that happened in the Railway series in it. If Awdry read about an incident in a magazine, he would cut it out and put it in this scrapbook, and he would use it as inspiration for Railway series stories later. This book was basically the Bible of the Railway series. It was like Awdry's Bible, well, you know, beside his actual Bible as a reverend. Oh, how I'd love to have a look through this scrapbook. Every story of his is, however offbeat, is based on something that happened to some engines sometime, somewhere. Another reason that he kept this scrapbook was so that if someone wrote to him saying that his story was unrealistic, Awdry would be able to write back telling him that it is realistic. Wilbert's favourite example of this was from Percy's Predicament, where some trucks push Percy down a branch line and he gets perched on some trucks. Awdry got countless letters from railway fans saying, no actually.
No.
To which Awdry responded with, yes actually. Many rail fans wrote to Awdry saying the idea of Percy landing perfectly on top of the trucks without damaging them would be quite impossible. But Awdry's response to that was that it actually did happen, and it happened on the 13th of April 1876. While Wilbert Awdry was familiar with railways, it was only after writing railway series books that he realised he knew very little about it. Hence why he started to read more magazines and more books and talk to railwaymen to get inspiration, taking real-life events that actually happened to engines and using that as inspiration for his stories. Awdry's next rule was consistency. Like many of these rules, Awdry learned this one the hard way. Awdry believed that events from the stories or books must carry over into the next book, not just in the text but in the pictures as well. Consistency such as Thomas's brick shed getting an extension with Percy and Toby joining the branch line, and then getting an extension again years later in the series, is an example of this continuity. While Awdry had many issues with consistency because of the illustrators, Dalby, while a pleasant man, didn't care much for consistency, according to Awdry, to which Dalby responded with, "What does it matter? These books will fade out in a few years' time. It's not as though there's going to be a long-running series of them." Oh, Dalby, you innocent man, you. Undeniably, Awdry's biggest issue with inconsistency was Henry. He got endless questions from children such as, why did Henry become green? Why was Henry painted blue? Why does Henry look like Gordon here? Why does he have square buffers here? Why does he have Gordon's cab? By 1952, Awdry had developed a stock answer for this question, being that Henry's buffers and cab had become rusted while in the tunnel, hence them being replaced with Gordon's here. He came out of the works looking like Gordon. Awdry said that Gordon was so rude to Henry about it that it made him ill, and he only felt better again when the fat director gave him round buffers and green paint. Needless to say, consistency is paramount when writing for stories. This is also where having a map of Sodor came in very handy for Awdry, because now there could be a consistent railway where all these crashes and incidents would take place. Using inspiration from his scrapbook, these first two rules came in relatively easy for Awdry, but it's the final three principles about writing which were always hardest for him. The third rule was brevity. This is where we get into the actual writing part of Awdry's disciplines. Brevity, for those who don't know, means to be abrupt, short, quick, and to the point when it comes to writing short stories. Each page was sort of like a chapter with a picture next to it. The wordage allowed on each page was roughly 80 to 90 words per page. There were to be 2 stories of 7 pages and 2 stories of 8 pages. This was the plan at first, but as the series continued, Awdry's page numbers kept getting cut down. Because of this restraint, it was rare that they would flow so naturally that it seemed the story was writing itself. More often than not, it was a very hard grind. It's interesting. Sometimes having word restrictions can actually help your stories become more streamlined. A good example of this is the scripts for Series 10. You see, the left side of the script is very wordy because it's describing the action, while the right side is much more stripped back, since that's the part of the reading script. So sometimes, in writing, it's actually important to have restrictions on yourself. Awdry would first select the instance to base the story on, then those instances would have to be researched, then he would ponder over each story until he could see them fitting into the pattern, with each story flowing into the next one. Eventually he would figure out what he wanted to say with the story, but not exactly how to write it. It would be no use putting a piece of paper in the typewriter and just expecting the correct length to emerge. So what Awdry would do is that he would write out the full story, no matter how long it took to write. It could amount to 200 words if he wanted, but once his first draft was on paper, however unsatisfactory it may appear to him, at least he actually had something written down, and now he had a draft to work with. But now comes what Awdry calls the tedious part, rewriting and rewriting that first draft, or as Awdry describes, to prune your story. Similar to how you would prune a tree, cutting away the broken branches or deadheading it to promote growth, the same is true for writing, pruning away at your story from 200 words all the way down to the required 80 or 90 on the page. A good example of this pruning is Duke. You see, in the early drafts it was the Duke, but after so many sessions of pruning, his name became just Duke. Awdry even kept notes of how many times times a page would be rewritten. According to him, the highest number of pruning he did on a given page was 20 rewrites. That's mad, isn't it? You'd never guess how much rewriting went into these books. While it was tedious, it was also well worth it for the final story. Going from your 200-word diarrhea to a handy 80-word salad while saying the same thing is a pretty damn satisfying thing to do, cutting away all of the fluff of your stories. There is nothing worse than having an incoherent word salad that nobody can understand even if they tried. And Awdry's fourth rule for writing was careful choice of words. With fewer fluff words left, each word in your story is now significantly more important, which means further revision is therefore needed. Awdry would look for synonyms, which are basically other ways of saying words. With fewer words to say in your story, it's important that you look for those synonyms which carry meaning. While it might not be totally important to the child, it will be for the parent who has to read them. Remember, you're not just writing for the kids, but the parents too. They are the ones who are picking the stories. They are the ones who are going to get bored of something substandard. So it's also them whom you're trying to convince that you know what you're talking about. Some of Awdry's favourite letters to come from railwaymen, who said that his books are the only ones they can read to their children without squirming inside. Because these books are written by someone who actually knows their subject, many of the railwaymen who contacted Awdry told him of similar stories that would happen on their railways, which would prompt Awdry to write more of those stories in future editions of his books. Something that Awdry would despise is when radio broadcasts would change the wording of his stories. Wording that took him days to perfect. Often their simple little edits would, in Awdry's eyes, make nonsense of the story. And for his fifth and final rule, we have fluency. Once Awdry got the best stories, wrote them out, pruned them, and then reworded them again, now was time for fluency. This was Awdry's way of helping the adults out. Each story must be made to be easily read aloud, with each word coming trippingly off the tongue. Trippingly meaning in a quick and lively manner, which is a new word I've learned today. This is true for fluency, to have the words fly off the page in an easy to read manner, with no tongue-twisting phrases, which, as Awdry said, can only be done by trial and error. Awdry used to test read his stories to his children, but when they grew up and left the house, he would record himself on a tape. If he found himself tripping over his words, he would rewrite that part of the story. This taping would suggest where polish and fluency could be obtained. By changing the position of words here and there could be several words which need to be changed, but even altering just one word can sometimes make the difference between the readability of a page. Once your story is now fluent, the final product gives a sense of spontaneity. While the finished product might look simple to the average Joe, but paradoxically can only be the result of hard work. So, those are the 5 disciplines that Awdry used for writing the Railway series. They are accuracy, consistency, brevity, careful choice of words, and fluency. Now, of course, take these rules with a pinch of salt. Not every story is going to need these rules. These were just the specific rules that Awdry used when creating his Railway series stories. So keep them in mind when you're creating your own. By just redrafting your story for fluency and timekeeping, it can be quite fun. So the next time you're reading the Railway series, think about how many times Awdry actually took to get the words perfect on the page. Think about how many rewrites he had and how simplistic yet complicated the dialogue is. And when you try to write your own stories, try applying some of these rules to your storytelling. Try setting the same limitations that Awdry had, such as 7-page stories with roughly 80 to 90 words per page. Follow these rules and you too can write good Thomas stories, just like Wilbert Awdry. I still wish he mentioned Rule 55 though.
Rule 55. You can't do it.
Thanks for watching everyone, and slán bhaile. So did Awdry just forget to use these rules for Missing Coach, or what?
No.